A Canticle for Leibowitz, first published in serialized form in 1959 before being expanded into a novel, spans centuries of post-apocalyptic history following a nuclear war. Throughout this long span of time, its story is centered on a monastery in the American Southwest. And while written in the 50s, when the threat of nuclear war was still fairly new, it's relevant today not just because the threat of atomic annihilation is back on the forefront, but in terms of its cyclical view of history. The story begins with a monk, Brother Francis Girard, enduring his Lenten fast out in the Utah desert, where he meets a wandering pilgrim. The encounter with this pilgrim nudges Francis toward a small hole in the rocky ground, which he finds himself compelled to dig into both to find shelter in the desert and to satisfy his curiosity. And for his efforts, he discovers a long-buried fallout shelter, which he discerns from the pre-apocalypse English writing he can barely read. The rest was buried, but the first word was enough for Francis. He had never seen a fallout, and he hoped he'd never see one. A consistent description of the monster had not survived, but Francis had heard the legends. He crossed himself and backed away from the hole. Tradition told that the Beatus Leibowitz himself had encountered a fallout, and he had been possessed by it for many months before the exorcism which accompanied his baptism drove the fiend away. He overcomes his fear and ventures inside, where he finds what to us is meaningless detritus. A lunch pail, a betting form for the horse races, some old schematics. A diagram, it seemed, but a diagram of white lines on dark paper. Again, he felt the thrill of discovery. It was clearly a blueprint, and there was not a single original blueprint left at the Abbey, but only inked facsimiles of several such prints. I've always liked that image of monks reverently copying these old blueprints and adding all sorts of decorative embellishments around the margins of it because they have no idea what any of the symbols actually represent. The Abbey is named for an engineer, Isaac Edward Leibowitz, who, after the war, the Flame Deluge as it's come to be known, worked to preserve pre-war scientific knowledge from the angry mobs during this simplification, a violent backlash against engineers and scientists, against science itself, as the cause of the nuclear annihilation that had befallen the world. Or rather, that the world's leaders had brought upon it. But sure, blame the engineers. Good luck irrigating your fields, screwheads. Or pegheads, I guess. They don't seem like the sort that would know too much about thread pitch. Francis spends years making an illuminated copy of the blueprint, medieval style with gold leaf and little creatures around the edges. He's by this time figured out that the monks were wasting a lot of time coloring in most of a page in blue ink. The Abbey is dedicated to preserving this recovered knowledge, even if they themselves don't understand what any of it means. Sort of a Dirt League Brotherhood of Steel or Adeptus Mechanicus. Years later, Francis is sent to New Rome with his illuminated manuscript to present at the canonization of Leibowitz as a saint. But he gets accosted by mutants who steal the illuminated copy, though they leave the original and laugh at him for his lame attempt to duplicate the much more ostentatious copy. Francis presents the original blueprint he found all those years before to the Pope, who puts things in perspective. "It was nothing, Holy Father. I only regret that I wasted 15 years. Wasted? How wasted? If the robber had not been misled by the beauty of your commemoration, he might have taken this, might he not?" Leibowitz is canonized as a saint, Francis is praised and given a benediction to take back to the Abbey along with some gold to buy back the manuscript from the robbers, but he gets killed on the way back, so ends Francis. The book is a story, or rather a collection of partial stories about the flow of events. There are no heroic stands that change the course of history, only people doing the best they can and making choices that reverberate for centuries in ways they can't know at the time. Like Asimov's Foundation, it's more about the grand historical narrative than the individual characters. And so we jump ahead a millennia. Thon Taddeo Pfaffentrott is a young scholar who has been invited to the Abbey, which has amassed an extensive archive and library of scholarly analysis. But of course, it's not so simple. There's a web of intrigue involving the various warlords and proto-nations fighting for control of chunks of North America. Taddeo is the bastard son of one of these rulers. The short of it is that Taddeo goes to the Abbey with mixed impressions all around, set against the backdrop of war and intrigue that shows a world recovering. The monks preserve fragments of the old knowledge, but preservation has become an end unto itself, locked away in vaults to keep it safe from the world. Taddeo wants to revive scientific progress, but he gives little thought to the consequences. But who will govern the use of the power to control natural forces? Who will use it? To what end? How will you hold him in check? Such decisions can still be made, but if you and your group don't make them now, others will soon make them for you. Mankind will profit, you say. By whose sufferance? The sufferance of a prince who signs his letters X? Or do you really believe that your collegium can stay aloof from his ambitions when he begins to find out that you're valuable to him? All the old seeds are planted. It's this section of the book that has the most story in terms of plot and character interaction. Taddeo and the poet are particularly notable. I do wonder if the poet was a partial inspiration for wit in Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight series. And it's here where we see a world we can start to recognize. It's a bit jumbled. Medieval structures, both physical and social, sprinkled with post-Renaissance and even later elements, for example, the dynamo-powered arc light in the library. But unlike an irradiated wasteland, we're familiar with the pieces. The struggle to survive has given way to politics and wars, seizing power and building nations. Or rather, getting back to where we were. The war concludes with several tribes and principalities falling before a uniting conqueror. A nation is born. It was the year a king came riding out of the east to subdue the land and own it. It was a year of men. The third and final part is again hundreds of years later, and the world has surpassed our own in technological development. The abbey is still on the same site, though by now surrounded by a major city. Centuries old, but recently widened, the highway was the same road used by pagan armies, pilgrims, peasants, donkey carts, nomads, wild horsemen out of the east, artillery, tanks, and 10-ton trucks. Its traffic had gushed or trickled or dripped according to the age and season. Once before, long ago, there had been 6 lanes and robot traffic. Then the traffic had stopped. The paving had cracked and sparse grass grew in the cracks after an occasional rain. Dust had covered it, desert dwellers had dug up its broken concrete for the building of hovels and barricades. Erosion made it a desert trail crossing wilderness. But now there were 6 lanes and robot traffic, as before. And the looming threat of nuclear war is back as well. Lucifer has fallen is the code phrase being uttered in the halls of power. The Brotherhood of St. Leibowitz remains true to its purpose, the preservation of knowledge. The order, the mission, the church, civilization must continue. And to that end, the Leibowitzian monks have a starship and a long-standing plan to establish the church in the Alpha Centauri system, should the worst fears come to pass. They will send many of their people along with their relics and archives to carry on the torch. Remember this Earth, never forget her, but never come back. If you ever come back, you might meet the Archangel at the east end of the Earth, guarding her passes with a sword of flame. I feel it. Space is your home hereafter. It's a lonelier desert than ours. God bless you, and pray for us. The ship launches bound for a new world, and missiles launch to end ours. The cycle is set to continue elsewhere. Are we doomed to do it again and again and again? Have we no choice but to play the phoenix in an unending sequence of rise and fall? Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, Greece, Carthage, Rome, the empires of Charlemagne and the Turk, ground to dust and plowed with salt. Spain, France, Britain, America, burned into the oblivion of the centuries. And again and again and again. The idea of cyclical history is at the core of this story. We can look back and see the rise and fall of civilizations. We can see the common traits that precede a fall. And while Canticle for Leibowitz is built on this, it's worth noting that the monks didn't devise the plan and acquire a starship because they knew war was coming. It was a hedge. They knew it was possible, so they prepared a contingency. There's no predictive psychohistory like in Foundation, in which the stories are built on the idea of a predictive historical model. There's always that temptation to flip the temporal axis. If we can see the causes and mechanisms of the past, can we predict the future? Usually attempts to quantize historical processes and project forward don't work very well. For example, most of the Marxist writing of the 20th century was a series of attempts to explain why nothing happened the way dialectical materialism said it should. Much more recently, we have Strauss-Howe generational theory, for example, which is constructed with a focus on American history and posits a cycle of 4 turnings that collectively take about 80 years to complete. 4th turnings are dramatic, and at their conclusion, the nation is fundamentally transformed in some way. The Revolution, roughly 80 years later the Civil War, 80-ish again the Great Depression and World War II. And here we are today facing all sorts of potential mayhem, seemingly on schedule. The model has a lot to recommend it. I've referred to the fourth turning several times here as a shorthand. But it's not really a predictive model, at least not yet. So far, all of its data points are looking backward and inferring a pattern, sometimes glossing over things that don't fit the pattern. For example, the rapid cultural, political, and economic transformation that occurred in the teens and 20s with the Great War, Prohibition, women's suffrage, Federal Reserve Act, income tax, and changing how the Senate is elected through the 17th Amendment doesn't neatly line up with the cycle. It's addressed, but not entirely satisfactorily. So is it predictive of a historical cycle? We're going to test it in the next few years. If between now and 2030 or so we have a civil war, a world war, or some other crisis that knocks America out of its current internal tension, either through a return to ideals of liberty and limited government or transformation into a technocratic authoritarian system, then we'll have a single data point supporting a predictive historical model working decades in advance, though in very broad terms. But on a more fundamental level, things playing out in accordance with what Strauss and Howe's theory says will happen is thoroughly depressing. Not just because fourth turnings are a bitch and a lot of people suffer and die, but because it suggests that a Canticle for Leibowitz is right. We will keep making the same mistakes, that on some level we're locked into a cycle of destruction. I don't believe that we are. Sociology isn't physics after all. But cyclical models may have some validity, if for no other reason that the idea of inevitability amongst individuals can be self-fulfilling for a group, and doing the same things tends to get the same results. Of course, there is also a certain optimism to Canticle for Leibowitz. When Earth is engulfed in nuclear war for the second time, it doesn't snuff out all of humanity. There are small colonies elsewhere. Civilization will survive and branch out in time. We could say it's still a net gain. More inhabited planets means more chances to win. The long-term trend is advancement and expansion of human civilization, even if there are dramatic peaks and valleys on the way. Perhaps it's a matter of scale and perspective, of values and priorities. I'll end with this exchange from the book. I can't accept it. How can a great and wise civilization have destroyed itself so completely? Perhaps, said Apollo, by being materially great and materially wise, and nothing else.
There is a slight nod in this, of course, to A Canticle for Leibowitz. I didn't want to do quite the same story, but the truth is the Church has always kept records during the Dark Ages, which is my main inspiration for this,